When I was visiting arcades in my youth, it wasn't rare to come across games made by a company called Capcom. Probably the earliest one I genuinely remember best is Commando, a vertically scrolling running gun that was really difficult. I recall the side-scrolling Ghosts and Goblins as well, another one that robbed you of your credits super fast. Gunsmoke was out around that time, another running gun similar to Commando. It was also pretty hard to miss the shoot 'em up classic 1943, a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up that was again really hard. There were many others, but you get the point. Capcom was really making a name for themselves in the mid-80s with a slew of well-made and challenging titles. Most of these games were done on 8-bit hardware using the Z80 CPU all the way up until the latter half of the decade. It was around 1987 when Capcom began moving up to games being run by the Motorola 68000 16-bit CPU. You could find games like Bionic Commando that year, sporting a big upgrade in color and overall technical pizzazz. The infamous first Street Fighter landed that year as well, and no matter what you think of how it played, it certainly looked impressive for the time. But Capcom had also been developing new arcade technology behind the scenes for years at that point. Inspired by the success of Nintendo's PlayChoice 10 and Versus line of machines, Capcom took the 68000 CPU, paired it with some specialized custom graphics chips, an FM sound chip, and wrapped it up as their new flagship arcade board that would run all their new software. Dubbed the CPS, which was short for Capcom Power System, or Capcom Play System depending on who you ask, it was released in 1988 and quickly took the arcade by storm. Its games looked orders of magnitude better than most of the stuff we were used to, and in this episode, we will be going over almost every single title released for it. No kidding, there are nearly 30 games here, so let's get started. Up first was a two-player co-op shoot-'em-up called Forgotten Worlds. This was one weird playing game too. There was a standard 8-way joystick that moved around your hero, while a rotary knob spun you around 360 degrees so you could fire all around you. To shoot, you had to push in the rotary knob, making for one hell of a learning curve. I kept trying though because this was one incredible looking game at its release in 1988. The backgrounds were otherworldly, the bosses were massive, and the action was fast and furious. The gameplay was boosted by a currency system of collecting blue orbs and using it to buy items at a store. You could add health, armor, and weapons to your arsenal that really made things more accessible. It was a tough one to learn, but it certainly didn't lack for appeal. I had played Ghosts and Goblins plenty by the time I first saw 1988's Ghouls and Ghosts, and I still wasn't prepared for it. Oh my, was it an eye-opener. Not just because it looked and sounded great, but it quickly squashed my 13-year-old self-esteem by basically owning me on the very first stage. This side-scrolling action game was designed to test your skill in the most brutal of ways. You could only take 2 hits, many of the enemies respawned constantly, and the boss encounters were nothing short of quarter-munching trial and error. Eventually, I made it a tad further, but I was never able to even come close to beating this in the arcade. It wasn't for lack of trying, but I didn't see the ending until the Sega Genesis port a few years later. "1989 brought us one of my favorite Capcom games ever, Strider. This was a single-player epic set in the future where you must infiltrate a madman's city and break his iron grip over the Earth's population. You are essentially a ninja that wields a plasma sword and has access to robotic pets like a tiger and Hulk. As you make your way through the various stages, you'll face all kinds of crazy enemies, run down exploding mountains, walk upside down through anti-gravity chambers, and even swing through the trees of the Amazon jungle. In other words, it has great variety. Like the CPS games before it, the visuals and sound were stunning and easily stood out in every arcade that year. When the Genesis port was announced, I salivated over the pictures for months and couldn't wait to get my hands on it. Also in 1989 came Dynasty Wars, a two-player hack-and-slash beat-em-up that I never saw in the arcade back then. It's rather cool considering the year it was released. It has a sort of RPG light system where you can level up your life and weapons by collecting orbs. You'll be fighting on horseback here, and the control gave you buttons to attack left or right specifically, which can be charged for a stronger blow. The story is based on the 3 kingdoms from Chinese history, and there are 4 different generals to take into battle, each with their own combat traits. It was ported home to numerous computers and even the PC Engine CD. I don't have any special memories of this one, but it's definitely worth a look if you enjoy the genre. "1989 brought the surprise action platformer Willow to the CPS. I adore this game and it remains one of my favorites from Capcom. It has everything: the characters from the movie, magic, items to buy in a store, and huge menacing enemies to battle. The visuals are colorful, the backdrop's beautiful, and even the music fits the mold. Sadly, this particular version of the property was never released on a home console, and I would have killed for a Genesis port. It's one of those games that make emulation a must for fans of old games. This one would be lost without it. Also in 1989 was UN Squadron, a horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up that was a first for Capcom's new technology. Here you choose from 3 heroes with different planes and abilities. Like a few other Capcom shooters, this one has a damage bar where you can actually take multiple hits before going down. This is not a bad game at all, and it looks great, especially the backgrounds and the detailed sprites. It saw a bunch of home computer versions, including a Super Nintendo edition that wasn't too bad itself. The final CPS release in 1989 was the classic beat-em-up Final Fight. At the time that this was released, the genre was filled with a bunch of clunky Double Dragon clones that honestly weren't all that great. Almost overnight, Final Fight redefined what a good beat-em-up was all about. The gameplay was fast, smooth, and the fighting felt like nothing before it. But the gameplay wasn't the only thing here that was ahead of the competition. In 1989, you were hard-pressed to find a game that looked this good. The sprites were huge and well detailed. There were a ton of them on the screen. The environments fit the story perfectly, really nailing the feeling of fighting through a major metropolis. The 3 heroes felt entirely different too. One slow and powerful with great grapple damage. The second faster and more mobile, but still capable of impressive damage. Finally, number 3 was a combo machine with Bruce Lee-like reflexes. Bring a friend along and you had one of the best arcade experiences that entire year. 1941 Counterattack was part of the Capcom 1940 series and our first CPS title in 1990. The numbering here was quite confusing because this was actually the third game released, but as the year indicates, the story takes place before the others. It's still a vertically scrolling shooter, but the visuals have been updated big time, and it looks better than ever. It's another one that uses a damage meter instead of being shot down by a single hit. The two-player mode is the way to play because this one is quite challenging alone. A year later, the Super Graphics received a home port that was considered quite well done, and it's been included in many compilations and classic packs since then. If you enjoyed the others, this one is very similar with a much improved presentation. Mercs was a 1990 run-and-gun that featured 3-player simultaneous co-op play. It's a direct sequel to Capcom's earlier Commando, now visually much improved thanks to the power of the CPS. It's another one that uses a life bar instead of single-hit deaths, and you'll need it because this has got the typical Capcom challenge in full force. Aside from being a well-designed game, it's the 3-player co-op that really elevates this above similar releases at the time. A trio of friends could dump countless credits into this one, trying to defeat it, and love every minute of it. A Genesis home port was done by Sega, but it lost the co-op multiplayer entirely. '90 also gave us Magic Sword, a side-scrolling action title that had you scaling a massive tower of more than 50 floors. It was set in a swords and sorcery world full of monsters and magic. Aside from controlling the main hero, you also have companions you can find to help you out in combat. There's a couple different endings and it supports co-op multiplayer. The visuals aren't hugely impressive, especially since it followed games like Willow, but the gameplay is rather engaging. There's secret doors that will warp you through the tower faster, and there are a number of boss encounters you'll face. There's a good game here if you give it enough time to understand the mechanics. It's seen numerous emulated compilation reissues, as well as home computer and Super Nintendo ports. Mega Twins was a wild action game released in 1990, kind of a mix of just about every platformer you've ever played. You'll run, jump, fly, and swim across many different environments and face a dizzying amount of enemies along the way. It's colorful, fast, and a great time when two players take on the adventure. It was also known as Chicky Chicky Boys and saw numerous ports to home computers, the Genesis, and the PC Engine CD. The arcade edition is by far the best way to play it, however. There's an intensity here that is missing elsewhere, and the sheer variety in the things you do and the enemies you face makes the entire experience. Good solid fun for two players. '90 kept on pumping out the CPS releases, with Carrier Air Wing landing in the latter half of the year. This was a follow-up to UN Squadron, a horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up featuring real planes and more two-player co-op action. You fly across numerous landscapes and fight highly maneuverable enemies along the way. The rogue nation Rabu intends to wage war on Japan, and it's your job to stop them. Lots of cool animations and some great environment damage is almost ruined by damage sponge enemies. I mean, what the hell are these planes made out of that they can take this kind of damage? There's a good game here, but the gameplay can get pretty exhausting. The last game of 1990 for the CPS was Nemo, a side-scrolling platformer that I had never played before discovering it on MAME. It was based on the film Little Nemo: Adventures in Slumberland, and takes place across 7 stages as you attempt to rescue King Morpheus and his daughter Camille. The 2-player co-op sees Nemo and his pal Flip beat down enemies with their cane and scepter, jump on their heads, and throw things at them. It's actually got some really solid action, and I'm sorry I missed it back at its original release. Being that it's based on a licensed property, it likely will never be officially reissued. 1991 kicked off with a doozy, Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. This one set the arcade ablaze instantly, drawing every red-blooded child, teen, and young adult that was physically able. Word spread quickly of the ability to choose one of 8 fighters from across the globe, and beat the ever-loving hell out of your buddies. There had already been a few games of similar mold, but nothing had ever played like Street Fighter II. The feel of each attack connecting was so satisfying, and its 6-button interface gave you an impressive amount of variety in how to approach your opponent. It would have been impressive enough had it stopped there, but Capcom included throws and special moves as well, elevating this so far above previous titles in the genre, it redefined it to its very core. So popular was this, it boosted a slumping arcade industry for years to follow, giving birth to renewed interest in these types of games so powerful, nearly every game developer in existence tried copying it. Few ever came close, and its sequels still reign supreme over 30 years later. '91 was also the year The Three Wonders was released, a compilation arcade game that featured 3 different titles. First up was the run-and-gun Midnight Wanderers. This was a mix of Gunstar Heroes and Ghouls and Ghosts. If that sounds cool, well it is, and this one was quite the solid entry that could have easily stood on its own with a little more polish and content. The second game was Chariot, a shoot-'em-up that uses the same world and similar art style. This didn't quite have the depth of the better shooters at the time, but the visuals are solid and it plays well enough, and it's a great companion to Midnight Wanderers. It was almost as if these were 2 halves of the same game. The third title is a single-screen action puzzler where you move blocks around to dispatch enemies. Don't Pull doesn't fit in with the first 2 games at all, but it's very similar to other titles like Sega's Pingo. This trilogy came home to the Saturn and Playstation 7 years later, but the odds of finding an actual arcade cabinet are pretty slim these days. Not Capcom's finest, but all 3 are worth trying and include multiplayer. The King of Dragons was also a 1991 release, a hack-and-slash beat-em-up with extremely simple play mechanics. This was essentially Capcom's first foray into the type of game that would eventually become their D&D series. Its setup is very similar to Final Fight, just now with weapons, magic, and a leveling system that gives your heroes improved attacks and survivability. There are 5 classes to choose from, with each one being proficient and deficient in various areas, making the co-op multiplayer all about strategic choice. This elevates the experience and takes the otherwise simple play mechanics to the next level. I also love the music in the game. It's absolutely fantastic, and some of Capcom's best from this hardware. A Super Nintendo port followed up a few years later that was decent, but the arcade is in a class all its own. Captain Commando was a 1991 beat-em-up that shared a universe with Final Fight. This is Metro City decades into the future, and crime once again runs rampant, now spreading across the entire globe. Captain Commando and his team must stop countless uber-powered criminals and their leader Scumicide. The co-op multiplayer capable gameplay gives you access to 4 different commandos. There are robot suits that you can get to aid you in battle, and the mechanics feature a few more moves beyond the standard Final Fight setup. You can dash attack and dash jump attack. I wasn't a big fan of this one because the characters and setting just didn't appeal very much. I much preferred Final Fight. This had Super Nintendo and PlayStation ports a few years later. It was part of the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle, and it's been on digital services like Capcom's Arcade Stadium. Knights of the Round is based on the old King Arthur legend and the final CPS game released in 1991. You can choose between Arthur, Lancelot, and Percival on their quest to destroy the evil King Garibaldi and unite the land. Like the King of Dragons, it relies heavily on weapons-based hack-and-slash gameplay, now with the added abilities of blocking and attack reversals. You can steal horses from enemies and use them to attack as well. All 3 available heroes can be used during the co-op multiplayer, and each one has unique desperation attacks. CPS games were starting to look better and better by this point, and Knights of the Round was a very nice looking title. I also enjoyed the music. There's a Super Nintendo port out there, but like always, it's pretty heavily cut back. You're gonna want this one on the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle or the Capcom Arcade Stadium. Just as the World Warrior began 1991 with a bang, so did Street Fighter II Champion Edition do the same thing in 1992. Players from every region across the globe wanted to play as the 4 boss fighters, and here they could finally do it. It has a bunch of small art and balancing changes and now allows mirror matchups. Not much more to say on this one. Street Fighter II had been around for a year, and this had boosted interest right back up. You had 4 new fighters to learn, and it was as fun as ever. Also in 1992, Varth, Operation Thunderstorm, was yet another take on the idea of a supercomputer hell-bent on eliminating mankind. All the machinery and weapons on planet Varth have turned homicidal, and it's your job to burn them all to the ground. The vertically scrolling gameplay isn't anything new and very similar to countless titles before it, including Capcom's own releases. It uses various weapons you can get in the field as well as a couple of optional satellites that act as shields and additional firepower. This is a decent shoot 'em up, but I wouldn't go out of my way to play it. In fact, back at the time, there were few other ways to play it because Capcom never ported it to a home console. It did eventually see release in emulated compilations like Capcom's Classic Collection Volume 2.
Power up. Wide shot.
Out of left field comes 1992's Quiz and Dragons, a trivia-based fantasy game that has you rolling the dice and making your way across a playfield by answering questions about sports, history, and movies. Get enough correct answers to defeat your foe and move on. I never saw this in the arcade, but it's a pretty fun game that I like to fire up every so often. Many of the questions are easy, but every so often it'll stump you with something obscure or about a subject you know nothing about. It's best in multiplayer where you can challenge your friends and make fun of one another for not remembering basic history questions or forgetting what happened with your favorite movies. This one was also included in the Capcom Classic Collection Volume 2, with a special mode that has questions about Capcom's video games. This is surprisingly playable and comes highly recommended.
Question 8. Question 9. Question 10. Question 11.
The final Street Fighter II for the CPS came at the end of 1992 in the form of Turbo Hyper Fighting. This took everything you knew about Street Fighter II and sped it up immensely, pretty much guaranteeing you needed to readjust all your strategies. Most of the fighters also received additional special attacks that really changed their gameplay possibilities. There was also a slew of new colors added for the costumes. In less than a year, Capcom had released 2 upgrades to the Street Fighter II formula, and they did indeed draw me back in each and every time. Street Fighter II was just that good, and it kept on getting better. Mega Man: The Power Battle wasn't released until late 1995 and was among the final games for the CPS. It takes the boss fights from the popular series and turns it into an arena-based fighting game. You can choose between Mega Man, Proto Man, and Bass, fighting your way through a gauntlet of bad guys on your way to dash the plans yet again of the evil Dr. Wily. After you beat a foe, you gain their weapon, and that can be switched on the fly from that point on. Best part is you can team up in co-op mode and battle the bosses together, making this one hell of a good time. It's the best of Mega Man in arcade form. Jump in, battle the bosses, and gain lots of new weapons. It's one of the biggest surprises on the CPS and can be found in compilations like the Capcom Arcade Stadium. Capcom also upgraded the CPS with Q-Sound capabilities during its life, and starting in late 1992, we got releases like Warriors of Fate, a direct sequel to Dynasty Wars. This was a radical departure in look and feel, landing more closely to Knights of the Round and the King of Dragons titles. It has improved sound and visuals across the board and has both horseback and on-foot combat. Again, there are multiple heroes to choose, and there is 3-player co-op for you and your friends. The story was changed around for the Western release, which you can find in the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle and the Capcom Arcade Stadium. There were Japanese ports to the Saturn and PlayStation as well. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs was also on the Q-Sound-enabled CPS Dash. Released in 1993, it was based on the comic of the same name, a rebranding of an earlier strip called Xenozoic Tales. It takes place 500 years in the future, where ancient creatures have reclaimed the Earth and a resurfaced human race that is exploiting them. You and your group are trying to stop the Black Marketeers from hunting these creatures and turning them hostile. There are multiple choices of heroes, each with different skill sets that directly affect the gameplay. Similar to releases like Final Fight, there are special attacks, weapons, and nasty combos to employ against your enemies. It's among the best looking CPS titles, but would never see a direct port to any home console. If you want to play this one, it's emulation only. (1993) also gave us the CPS Dash powered The Punisher, based on the popular Marvel anti-hero. This 2-player beat-em-up has weapons like knives, guns, grenades, and a whole assortment of other options at your disposal. Nick Fury can join you on your adventure as you attempt to bring down the evil Kingpin and his empire. This is point blank the best beat-em-up on the CPS arcade board. The visuals are top-notch, the audio fits perfectly, and though it's not over the top, the violence fits the IP in every way imaginable. A Genesis port was dropped shortly after on a meager 16 megabit card, which was far too small to do the arcade justice. As far as I'm concerned, this was the pinnacle of the genre for years, and one that must be played by fans of the comic. Our final set of games came in 1993 as well, both again on the CPS Dash. Saturday Night Slam Masters was a wrestling game that played a bit like Final Fight, but had loads more grapple moves and a single combat ring to battle your foes. The sprites here are huge and well detailed, definitely standing out as some of the best examples of the CPS hardware's capabilities. You got to choose from a cast of characters like Biff Slamkovich and Titanic Tim, and it even had Mike Haggar from the Final Fight series. The Japanese version has the best name ever, known there as Muscle Bomber, the Body Explosion. It was followed later that year by Muscle Bomber Duo Ultimate Team Battle, a tag team focused version that added mirror matches and a number of new moves for each wrestler. These two games need a bit of time to adjust to, but they play fantastic once you learn the moves. The original saw ports to the Super Nintendo, Genesis, and FM Towns Marty, and eventually compilations like the Capcom Arcade Stadium. The CPS was easily one of the most dominant arcade platforms ever released. Its games essentially boosted Capcom to the top as one of the most popular game-making companies in the world. The CPS was followed by the CPS-2 in 1993, now bolstered by an even faster 68,000 CPU and improved graphics and sound across the board. This back-to-back combo of killer arcade technology would entrench Capcom's titles for years, giving us hit after hit of quality software. The CPS story doesn't end there. There was also a CPS-3 in 1996, which gave birth to the insanely popular Street Fighter III and its upgrades. Capcom even tried to consolize the original CPS for the home market in 1994. Dubbed the Capcom Power System Changer, it was their attempt to capture some of the market that the Neo Geo AES had been enjoying. They didn't have much confidence in the device, however, and few were ever made. Of note, it did receive a backwards port of the CPS-2 powered Street Fighter Alpha. Fortunately, the majority of the CPS games are available on compilations for modern consoles, but there are a few exceptions that make emulators like MAME a necessity. If you missed any of these, or haven't played them in years, these were my personal golden years in the arcade, and I can't say enough good things about them. There was nothing like standing there in an arcade with your buddies, beating down bad guys, blowing enemies out of the sky, and whooping each other's asses for countless hours after school. Sometimes I cut them on just to have the sound playing in the background when I'm doing chores or working on a YouTube project. There's a comfort in that, a window to a past that made me who I am today. The memories are priceless and I'll never ever forget them. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.